I've been quietly working on a game project for about a year now. The main systems are built and the placeholder art is slowly getting replaced. But my game has a problem, probably more than one. The frame rate can plummet, and worse than that, the game's kind of slow and boring. Not bad for a year's worth of work, am I right? I want to thank Nova UI for sponsoring this video. It's my UI tool of choice. It's also the UI tool that I'm using in this project. Nova is a new kind of UI framework made for Unity developers, designers, and creators. Nova brings modern UI tools and features directly to the transform and prefab workflow you use every day in Unity. For me, the ease of use in creating adaptive layouts or adding visual polish with drop shadows, borders, and gradients, all within Unity, won me over almost immediately. Nova has joined the selective and short list of assets that I want with me in every project that I start. Nova also has a flexible data binding system, so now adding dynamic lists and grids to your UI only takes a few lines of code. Build your UI better, faster, and easier than ever before with Nova. You can try every Nova feature in the Unity editor for free, so check it out in the Unity Asset Store or use the link in the description below and see if Nova meets a need for your Unity project. But let's rewind a bit. When I was thinking about planning my next game project, I'd been playing two games, Creeper World 4 and Becastled. Both games made some really interesting and I think smart choices to keep the game simple, but still create hours of engaging play in genres that can get complicated in a hurry. I love the constant onslaught of the enemy fluid in Creeper World, and of course the base building mechanic in Becastled is almost always fun. So I wanted to take my favorite parts of these two games, mush them up, swirl them around, and add a dash of my own ideas. I also really wanted the player to have some role in building and shaping the world. And that's where the hex tiles came in. I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole of full-blown world generation. Too many ways to waste time, and it would be really easy to make something that doesn't look good. I also didn't want to sink time into handcrafting each world, and I know from previous failed projects how hard and time-consuming a good procedural world can be to build. Creeper World 4 and Becastled both have simple, but stylistically complete and believable game worlds. So yeah, hex tiles. And I gotta say, I was surprised by how simple the generation code was and how good looking the results were. The hex tiles seem to lend themselves to interesting and fairly organic looking shapes with minimal code tweaks. It just worked. Now mix in some base building mechanics, a handful of resources, an upgrade system, plus a tech tree, and you've got a pretty good picture of what the core game loop is going to look like. Oh, enemies. We're gonna need those. While I'm not 100% sure about their visual form, I'm feeling pretty confident about their general behavior. I'm largely stealing the Becastled mechanic of having enemies spawn at night at more or less a random position. I also really like the idea of telegraphing to the player where the enemy is spawning. All this avoids the tricky task of enemy-based generation or more complex AI. The AI spawn points show up in the morning, player has all day to plan, and when night comes around, the enemy pops out and heads towards the target. I want the game to be more about base building and planning than fast twitch responses, something I think both Creeper World and Becastled do quite nicely. Okay, so that's big picture view of the game, and so let's go head back to the problems. The frame rate can suck, and the game isn't that much fun. It sounds a bit like a final nail in the coffin of a failed project. To be honest, I was stuck for a few weeks, going in circles of self-doubt and general decision paralysis. I wasn't able to make decisions, and I wasn't sure how to move forward. I loved the game idea, I built most of the systems and they worked, but I was stuck, and I was waiting for some magical solution to spontaneously appear. And it didn't. So I explored the problem. I wanted to try and find the cause of the low frame rate. I spent the better part of 2 hours during a live stream trying to isolate the cause. I knew it was related to the number of enemies on the screen, no big surprise there. 50 enemies was no problem, 100, piece of cake. 150, well, here we started to see a drop. The drop in frame rate was linear, and that didn't much concern me. But then all of a sudden, it wasn't linear. Around 200 enemies, I started to see something exponential or quadratic. I didn't do the analysis, but it's growing. By the time I got to 300, it was basically impossible to play the game. So I toggled off features and mechanics and watched the profiler. Nothing much seemed to really budge the frame rate. And then I noticed the slowdown wasn't so much just the number of enemies, but it happened when all the enemies were getting close together. It turns out that some part of the pathfinding solution was getting really grumpy. My guess, somewhat educated, was that the pathfinding solution is using the physics engine, and when hundreds of enemies start cramming into the same location, the number of physics interactions skyrocketed. Then, once the physics engine couldn't complete all of its work in the default 200ths of a second, i.e. 50 frames per second, we got a runaway effect where the physics calculations get pushed into the next frame, making the situation even worse. So I had a cause, but no real solution. So more testing. I I found that I could take the same 300 or even 400 enemies and spread them out, having groups of 50 or 100 attack different targets, and the frame rate was very playable. So potentially, I could either spawn waves of enemies or make sure that the enemies don't all pile up on one target. Maybe not a perfect solution, but it does seem like a workable solution. And with some design changes, that's foreshadowing, it may not be as much of an issue at all. At this point, I was feeling encouraged. I was unstuck. So I started to look at the other problem. This is no fun and boring problem. Arguably, this is a much bigger problem. If nobody wants to play the game, it doesn't much matter what the frame rate is. So I circled back to the player experience. What were the first 5, 10, or 20 minutes going to feel like? If I could get that right, then I'd be well on my way to solving the boring game problem. And by fleshing out the player experience, I might be able to better shape how the enemies spawn and interact with the enemies. 2 birds, 1 stone, or maybe lots of little stones. Originally, I had planned on starting the game being focused on building up defenses. You get enough resources to build some defensive towers and just enough to jumpstart your economy. Which seemed great, until I tried it. Now, I'm a big believer that sometimes small tweaks can make big differences. Big problems don't always need big solutions. So rather than start by building towers, why not start the game with a couple of infantry units? Place your headquarters and you immediately get 2 supporting units that are more than enough to keep you safe for the first several nights while you build up your economy and unlock better defenses. This was a good start, but it wasn't quite enough. I'd been doing all my testing and prototyping on a large island of tiles. It looked nice, but it didn't give the player much incentive to build more tiles. And it wasn't awesome in terms of enemy spawn points. My system was pretty janky. So I shrank the player's starting area, and I shrank it a lot. Then rather than trying to find an empty tile for the enemy spawning, I picked a location a reasonable distance from the center of the player's base. Then used the pathfinding system to create a path to the player and finally spawn tiles along that path. And this did so many good things. Beyond looking cool, it solved the problem of making sure that the enemy could always reach the player. Not to mention, the resulting landscape gives a clear indication of where to place your defenses. Initially, I'd set all the hex locations that don't have a tile to be very expensive from a navigation perspective. This meant that when the enemy spawns and found a path from the spawn point to the player, it tended to follow paths that were already created. Or in other words, paths that already had tiles, since the cost of moving across a tile was much lower than moving across empty space. This tends to create alleys or pathways that will be used and reused by the enemy, making those slow to build towers easier to place in useful positions. Talk about a big win. Few small changes and the game is feeling way better. These changes also let me shift the focus of the game away from primarily defense and shift it toward more base building and developing the economy. Now you have time to build farms and place solar panels and mine other resources, while your flying infantry can defend your fledgling base. This helps set the foundations for a more complex economy, which in return can feed hungry defenses, unlock new buildings, and new upgrades. So is the game fun? Well, I'm no longer waiting for towers to be built and hoping that I put them in a good position. Instead, I'm thinking about what resources I need. I'm thinking about upgrades and unlocking new buildings. I'm thinking about where I need to build new tiles so I can better defend my base or expand out to collect new resources. My basic units can move and respond to the enemy. All of this means I'm in control, and that feels a lot more fun. There's more work to do, of course. The project is in a way better place than it was just a few weeks ago. And the performance issue, the frame rate crashing with a large number of enemies? Now this is a hard one for me to explain, and I might be wrong, but I don't feel like that's much of a problem anymore. The shift in design makes me believe that the number of enemies is way less important. The fact that enemies can now spawn all around you instead of only on already placed tiles means an enemy is more likely to be spread out and attack different targets. Before, I felt like killing the enemies was the main goal or central mechanic, and that's just not anymore. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. Hey, if you made it this far into the video, maybe think about giving the video a like, or better yet, leave a comment down below. If you got an idea for something that could be added to the game or a way to solve a problem, I'd love to hear those comments. If you want to follow the progress of the game more closely, I stream almost every Thursday, and you can check out the channel homepage for the next scheduled stream, as well as a playlist with all of the past streams. And as always, hope that was interesting and better yet useful for you and your project. And until next time, happy game development.